Hi, everyone. So, in this week and this chapter, we're looking at the idea of planning and what do we mean by planning. And as managers, why is it important for us to plan and how might we go about it? And so, what we're going to be looking at is, first of all, what is the nature and purpose of planning? We'll then dive into actually how we go about strategically managing our planning process. So, strategy being all about where do we want to be in the future and how might we get there. And then we're going to look at some of the different approaches to goal setting and planning and dig into them a little bit and have a look at some of their pros and cons. So when we start thinking about planning, what do we actually mean about it? Mean by what it is, and why we might want to do it. So planning is often considered to be the core goal or the primary activity that managers need to do, because it actually is where we set up the ideas, the goals, and the plans for where we're going to go. And so without good plans, it's very hard for everyone to know where to go, which is why it's considered to be that key skill and key operational area for managers. And so when we're talking about planning, what we're looking at is what we want to happen. So where do we want to end up? What is the ends or the goals that we're thinking about? As well as how are we going to do it, right? So we're talking about the ends, which is the goals, and the means, which is the ways we're going to get there. So you might like to think of it as the destination as well as the journey. And there's three kind of core levels of planning or parts that we can think of when we think of planning. So we've got our big picture, which is where we want to actually understand what are our organizational objectives or goals, so the really big picture. Then the strategies that sit underneath how we're going to actually get there. So what are we going to be able to do, or what do we need to do in order to achieve those objectives or goals? And then plans that are the sort of more specific action steps that help us to coordinate all the different people that are going to be playing a role in achieving those strategies towards the ultimate end goals. So why do we want to plan and why might we need to plan? There's sort of 5 key reasons that we might want to do this. So first of all is that we want to provide some actual direction. Yep. So you can imagine if nobody's established any goals, nobody's got an idea of what we want to achieve and how we might get there, then essentially people are just doing whatever. And so being able to provide that clear direction about this is where we want to go and why, it brings people together in a way that they can then start to coordinate their efforts in a way that is more aligned to that direction. So as you can imagine, this reduces then the uncertainty attached to what people are trying to do, because if they're not sure where they're headed, then there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around it. And there's also going to be a lot of uncertainty attached to the outcomes of what you might want to achieve. So if you don't know where you're going, you don't necessarily know how to get there either. And so you can also imagine that this then creates a lot of waste, and you might have people doing duplication of tasks or not doing things that should be done, which is then wasting those resources. And so we also want to plan so that we can establish those goals, which help us then set standards that we can then evaluate and measure against to know if we're getting in the direction that we want to get to, or perhaps ways that we can start to understand if the goal is wrong or we've changed our mind because of some changes in the environment that we then start to monitor because we've got those standards and that ability to monitor our environment. It allows us to then calibrate our plans so that we, first of all, kind of say where we want to go, what we want to achieve in terms of getting there, and then to be able to kind of monitor the way that we're getting there, to be able to sort of see, oh, well, actually, we thought this was going to happen, but in fact, this other thing is at play now. And so we either need to shift our goals or change our approach to achieving those goals. And so because we're aware of where we're wanting to head, we can be much more tuned to our actual environment that we're working in. and then be able to calibrate our plans as we go. But, you know, planning isn't everything. And so there's criticisms and limitations of planning that we need to be aware of. And, you know, I know that for some people, the idea of planning just seems like the idea of just sitting down and just making things up, setting up, you know, just writing boring documents that don't really mean anything in the real world. And that can be a legitimate criticism if the plans aren't done well, or if they're done for the sake of sort of ticking boxes. And plans can also create rigidity. So what we then end up with is this idea of, well, this is what we're doing and we're sort of stuck to it. You know, it's the idea of we've created this roadmap and we have to go in that direction and we can't deviate from it. And, you know, if we're halfway down the highway and there's a roadblock, well, what do we do now? We're stuck. All we can do is stop, because this is the plan and we have to stick to it. So that would be an idea of a very rigid and unideal plan, because it doesn't allow for that responsiveness to the environment, or to enable people to actually create ways around and find new solutions to achieving goals. There's also the criticism that formal plans can't replace people's intuition and creativity. And this is something that you might encounter in the music industry, which is a creative space where people do tend to work a lot on their intuition and their creative, they're like using their creativity to kind of lead where they want to go. And the idea then is that a plan kind of creates these barriers and it kind of reins them in a way that disenables their creativity and intuitive decision making. And so I think there's a little bit of balance to be played there, in terms of not necessarily trying to corner people or rein them in, but also having ways to actually get things done in a way that helps and supports those intuitive and creative choices that people are going to make. And we'll dig into that a little bit when we get into some examples in the next few videos. The other criticism that's been laid at planning is that it focuses managers' attention on what's happening right now, and particularly keeping their focus too much on the competition, rather than looking more towards the future and where the organisation or the group wants to go, and what is going to help them survive. So it kind of, the criticism here is that it keeps people kind of focused here, then more out, and being more responsive to the environment. And again, I would call that an example of planning not done well, and planning that is kind of trying to be too rigid, and trying to not be focused on the end goals, but more focused on the process. So we have to delineate between where we want to go, which we can change, and how we're going to get there. And those two things don't necessarily have to be set in stone, but are there to help us formulate guidelines that we can then use as discussion pieces, rather than just having nothing, which then leads to confusion, misunderstandings, and a whole bunch of other problems. And the other criticism of planning, which can be a real problem, you might remember back to our discussion last week on cognitive biases, and biases such as confirmation bias and hindsight bias, where people tend to kind of, if something works, then they kind of think that they know this is the answer, I'm good at this, and I know how to make these decisions. And so what can tend to happen is, if you go through a formal planning process and it's successful, people kind of then want to use that as a template, like, this is what we've done before, so let's just keep doing the same thing. And so what we want to be able to do better in planning is having more of that environmental responsiveness ability, so that we're not just trying to kind of replicate and cookie cutter what we've done in the past that's been successful, but constantly be able to monitor and respond to any changes that may come about. So in our next video, we're going to dig a little bit more into what do we mean by strategic management. So where are we headed and how we're going to get there, and the actual processes that we might go through in order to achieve that.